The night sky above Hamburg vibrates with the drone of Avro Lancaster engines. It is July 24, 1943, and Squadron Leader John Searby sits in the pilot's seat of his lead Lancaster, watching the German coastline emerge from the darkness below like the spine of some sleeping beast. His radio crackles with the voices of 791 other bomber crews spread across the night, each aircraft carrying a full bomb load, each pilot acutely aware that they are flying into a wall of fire. For months, German radar has been systematically slaughtering RAF bombers. The Würzburg radar sets, brilliant pieces of engineering that can track an aircraft at 20 kilometers distance, have transformed the Luftwaffe's night fighters into precision killers. The flak bursts have become relentless, the losses unsustainable. And tonight, Searby's wireless operator holds something extraordinary. Beneath the Lancaster's belly, bundled in wrapped packages, are bundles of aluminium foil strips, each one roughly the width of a bookmark. They represent months of desperate scientific work, countless hours of debate within Air Ministry committees, and the kind of gamble that turns wars. In minutes, all across this armada, men will begin opening bundles and pushing handfuls of these glinting fragments out of their aircraft into the slipstream. The Luftwaffe's perfect radar system is about to become useless. An entire battle is about to be won not with bombs or bullets, but with what amounts to the world's first electronic countermeasure. What happened over Hamburg that night marked the moment when British ingenuity found a way to turn the tables on German technological superiority through an innovation so elegant, so devastatingly simple, that it would reshape the entire air war. The problem that drove this innovation had become a nightmare for Bomber Command. By 1942, the RAF had committed itself to a campaign of mass bombing against German industrial targets. This was total war, prosecuted from the air, night after night, against cities and factories across occupied Europe. The targets were real enough, the industrial calculations correct, but the cost was becoming catastrophic. German night fighters, guided by their sophisticated radar systems, were intercepting bomber streams with horrifying efficiency. A Lancaster pilot in 1942 had a statistical life expectancy measured in single-digit operations. The men who flew these missions, most of them barely 20 years old, understood this mathematics. Some crews did not last long enough to complete their initial training cycles. The Luftwaffe's Würzburg and Liechtenstein radar sets represented the most advanced electronic detection systems in the world. The Würzburg could track an aircraft at ranges up to 32 kilometers, measuring altitude, bearing, and range with remarkable precision. Ground controllers could vector their fighters onto incoming bomber streams with a degree of accuracy that made the night sky appear less like a vast, empty darkness and more like a carefully controlled, killing ground. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, the losses mounted with grim regularity. On May 30, 1942, the first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne cost 40 aircraft. 2 months later, a raid on Duisburg lost 43 bombers. By the spring of 1943, individual operations were consuming aircraft at rates that no amount of production could replace. The crews were flying further, staying longer over German territory and running into increasingly well-coordinated defenses. Searchlights, flak guns, and night fighters all worked in concert, their effectiveness multiplied by radar. Intelligence reports reaching Air Ministry planners made clear that without a solution, the bombing campaign would eventually strangle itself through attrition. Something fundamental had to change. The alternative was to abandon the only strategic capability Britain possessed that could strike directly at Nazi Germany. But Bomber Command would not accept that outcome. Somewhere in the scientific establishment, someone had to find a way to blind the German radar. The solution came from a place most unlikely, a research establishment in Hertfordshire devoted primarily to studying ways aircraft could be made harder to detect in the first place. In 1942, scientists working at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE, had begun investigating the properties of radar waves and the ways they could be scattered or absorbed. One particular scientist, working almost obsessively on the problem, recognized that radar waves follow predictable mathematical relationships. A perfect conductor. Conductor, when struck by radar waves at certain angles, does not simply absorb the signal or let it pass through, it reflects it back in all directions. If one could scatter millions of tiny conducting fragments throughout the air in the path of a radar beam, the reflected signal would become so chaotic, so overwhelmingly polluted with competing echoes, that the original target signal would simply vanish into noise. The substance required was straightforward to identify: aluminium foil, already in production as a byproduct of the aircraft manufacturing industry. The challenge was establishing the exact dimensions needed to scatter the specific frequencies the German radar operated upon. TRE physicists calculated that strips approximately 30 centimeters in length and 2 centimeters in width would produce the maximum confusion for the Würzburg system. The strips were produced in bundles at the de Havilland aircraft factory in Hatfield, rolled up in packages containing precisely 2,200 fragments each. The bundles were then wrapped in paper and assembled into larger packs, each containing 14 bundles, roughly 30,000 individual strips per pack, enough to create a cloud of confusion several hundred meters deep when dispersed properly. The manufacture of these deceptively simple devices escalated rapidly. By the summer of 1943, Hatfield was producing millions of strips per week, distributed across the aircraft factories at Hatfield itself, at Yeadon, near Leeds, and at other locations. The production process was extraordinarily labor-intensive. Each individual strip required cutting to precise dimensions, sorting into bundles, wrapping, and packing. What made the operation so challenging was the need for secrecy. If the Germans learned of the countermeasure before it was deployed, they could adjust their radar frequencies or implement other defenses. The entire operation was conducted under the codename Window, a deliberately bland designation that revealed nothing of its true purpose. Those involved in production were often unaware of what they were actually making. The bundles were distributed to bomber bases in sealed containers with strict orders against opening them until the precise moment they were needed. Senior RAF commanders debated whether the benefit of using Window would outweigh the risk of German retaliation. If Germany captured an intact bundle and analyzed it, they would immediately understand the principles behind the countermeasure and could begin developing their own versions. The meeting that finally authorized the deployment took place in June 1943. The decision was made almost as a matter of desperation. The losses were unsustainable. Window was authorized, and the operation was scheduled for the Hamburg campaign, which was itself one of the largest bombing offensives Bomber Command had mounted. The actual deployment began just after Searby's Lancaster and its companions crossed the German coast. At precisely calculated intervals, wireless operators and other crew members began opening the sealed bundles and pushing them out through flare chutes or bomb bay doors. The strips tumbled and spun through the night air, creating vast clouds of reflecting material that drifted across the sky in a pattern that appeared on German radar screens as a completely incomprehensible mass of noise. The radar operators sitting in their control stations that night experienced something unprecedented. Their carefully organized picture of the incoming raid, the precise tracks, the calculated courses, the methodical information that allowed them to direct fighters with such devastating accuracy, suddenly became useless. The radar screens filled with a chaotic mass of false echoes, making it impossible to distinguish real aircraft from the surrounding electronic clutter. Ground controllers improvised frantically, but without accurate information they could do nothing but vector their fighters toward the general direction of the bomber stream and hope they would encounter aircraft by chance. The Luftwaffe that night was flying blind. If you have found this interesting so far, a quick subscribe would mean an enormous amount and helps the channel continue. The bombers descended toward Hamburg unmolested. The losses that night were dramatically lower than any recent operation. The flak was wild and inaccurate. The night fighters, unable to obtain reliable radar contact, found their prey through luck rather than systematic intercept. Over the 4 nights of the Hamburg campaign, Bomber Command dropped approximately 9,000 tons of bombs on the city, creating a firestorm of such intensity that it altered the course of the entire bombing war. The city itself was devastated. The psychological impact on German leadership was equally significant. They realized that their entire radar defense system, the product of years of scientific development and enormous industrial investment, had been rendered impotent by something that cost virtually nothing to produce. The subsequent German response revealed the desperation of their position. They modified their radar frequencies, implementing new systems that operated at higher frequencies where the scattering characteristics changed. But they could not fundamentally solve the problem. Window represented a principle that would shape electronic warfare for decades to come. Once a detection system becomes dependent on electronic signals, the opponent can always find ways to corrupt, scatter, or deceive those signals. It is an asymmetry that still defines modern warfare. The operational impact of Window extended far beyond Hamburg. Every bomber operation deployed it from July 1943 onward. RAF bombers poured millions of strips into the night sky, creating electronic confusion across German airspace. The effect on casualty rates was immediate and measurable. Losses declined by approximately 50% in the months following the introduction of Window. This was not the complete solution to the air defense problem. There were still losses to flak and to Luftwaffe fighters that managed visual contact, but it represented a transformative change in the calculus of bombing. Crews who had been living under the constant knowledge that they might not return began to see statistics shift in their favor. Individual operations that would have cost 1 in 10 aircraft now cost perhaps 1 in 20. Across a campaign involving hundreds of operations, that mathematical improvement translated into hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives saved. The German response became increasingly desperate and, to some extent, chaotic. They attempted to deploy their own jamming transmitters, but without precise knowledge of the frequencies their own aircraft were using, they risked shooting down their own fighters. The Luftwaffe fragmented into competing factions, with different units experimenting with different radar frequencies and defense tactics. Coordination deteriorated. The unified air defense system that had been so effective in 1942 began to break apart. Window deployed by one RAF operation in August 1943 included roughly 100 million individual strips. The logistical operation alone was extraordinary. Every Lancaster, Halifax, and Sterling bomber in operation had to be loaded with the bundles. They had to be sorted by altitude. Higher altitude aircraft released their bundles at different times and places than lower altitude machines, creating a sustained cloud of confusion rather than a single impulse. Crews were instructed in precise procedures for the deployment. They were told to push the bundles out at regular intervals, maintaining discipline and formation discipline to ensure the electronic chaff spread evenly across the bomber's stream. The operation took on a ritualistic quality. Opening Window became a standard part of every bombing mission, as familiar to wireless operators as checking fuel quantities or confirming radio frequencies. But it never became routine in the psychological sense. There remained a tension between the knowledge that this was working and the awareness that it represented a technological contest in which the Germans were also innovating. Comparing the British approach with German attempts to develop their own countermeasures reveals much about the speed of technological development during the war. The Germans had their own physicists who understood the principles behind Window. They eventually produced their own version, codenamed Duple, but not until the autumn of 1943, more than 3 months after the British deployment. This delay proved critical. In those 3 months, the Luftwaffe's defense system had fragmented. The confidence that had characterized German air defense in 1942 had evaporated. Even when Duple became available, the Germans remained cautious about deploying it widely, partly through fear of the retaliation it might provoke, and partly because German aircraft interception procedures had become less reliant on radar. The American approach to the problem differed significantly. The United States had developed its own sophisticated bombing campaigns, but initially they were conducted in daylight rather than darkness. Daylight bombing faced different challenges: visual detection by fighters rather than radar, and therefore required different solutions. American bombers ultimately relied on heavy fighter escorts and more defensive armament rather than electronic countermeasures. It was only late in the war that American bombers began deploying their own chaff, by which time the principle was well established and the advantages less dramatic. The British innovation had the advantage of timing. It arrived at precisely the moment when the air war was reaching a critical juncture. A month earlier, and the Germans might have mounted a more coordinated response. A month later, and the campaign might have been abandoned as unsustainable. Window was effective precisely because it was disruptive at the right moment. The longer-term legacy of Window extended far beyond the Second World War. The principle of deploying chaff, now the universal name for the countermeasure, became a standard electronic warfare technique. Every major air force began developing methods to produce, distribute, and deploy chaff by the 1960s. The technological arms race between detection systems and countermeasures became a defining feature of military aviation. More profoundly, Window represented an early demonstration of a principle that would dominate modern warfare: the idea that electronic systems, for all their sophistication, could be deceived and degraded if an opponent understood their fundamental operating principles. This realization shaped the development of stealth technology, radar-absorbing materials, and modern electronic warfare tactics. Military strategists recognized that technological supremacy could be temporary, and that maintaining advantage required constant innovation. The psychological impact on those involved in air defense was significant. The certainty that had characterized German air defense planning in 1942, the sense that radar provided a comprehensive answer to the bomber threat, was shattered. That loss of confidence rippled through the entire defensive system. It contributed to a broader demoralization, a growing sense that Germany's technological innovations, impressive though they were, could not match the resourcefulness of British scientific establishment combined with American industrial capacity. Today, surviving examples of the Window bundles can be seen in aviation museums, though most are now fragile and require careful handling. The de Havilland factory at Hatfield, where millions of bundles were produced, stands partially preserved as a heritage site. The individuals who designed the strips and calculated their dimensions have largely passed from memory. The wireless operators and gunners who pushed the bundles out of their aircraft fuselages survived to old age in many cases, no longer living under the shadow of what had seemed like a statistical inevitability of death. The Hamburg firestorm itself left scars on the city that remained visible for decades. 30,000 people died in 4 nights. The economic damage was staggering, yet the city ultimately recovered, rebuilt, and today stands as a thriving, modern metropolis. The physical legacy of Window is almost invisible. Unlike bombing, which leaves ruins and craters, electronic warfare leaves no marks on the landscape, but its effects were perhaps more fundamental. It marked the moment when the technological balance began to shift decisively away from Germany. It demonstrated that the nation with the greatest scientific flexibility and the most rapid capacity for industrial innovation, not necessarily the nation with the single most advanced technology, would win. From that perspective, Window was not simply a countermeasure deployed against German radar. It was a strategic statement about the nature of industrial warfare in the modern era. In those moments, as Searby's Lancaster climbed back through the night toward the English coast, the wireless operator finally stowed the last of the empty bundles. Beneath them, Hamburg burned with an intensity that turned the night into something like dawn. The radar screens in the German control stations had now returned to something approaching normal functionality. The Duple bundles were still months away from deployment. The tactical advantage would not last, but it did not need to. The principle was established. The demonstration had been made. The technology that was supposed to protect Germany from air attack had been turned into a problem Germany would struggle to solve. From that night forward, the air war followed a different trajectory. Bombers continued to die, certainly. Flak remained a lethal threat. And night fighters that achieved visual contact were still deadly, but the sense that the defenses had achieved a comprehensive mastery of the night had been broken. Window proved to be neither a complete solution nor a temporary advantage, but rather the beginning of an entirely new dimension of warfare. It transformed how air defense would function, how technology would be employed in combat, and how the scientific establishments of the warring nations understood their competition. In the end, a handful of thin aluminium strips released into the night sky above northern Germany proved to be one of the most consequential innovations of the entire conflict.